Hello everyone and welcome back to our historical explorations. Find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a cup of tea or coffee, and settle in. Today, we are peeling back the shining armor to reveal the grimy, uncomfortable, and often stinking truth of daily life for a medieval knight. The knight on a long campaign was a creature of necessity. Water was for drinking, not for washing. Layers of grime became a second skin, a testament to the hardship of the road and the battlefield. Let us contemplate the idea of the body as a fortress. A knight's armor was his outer fortress of steel. His castle was his larger fortress of stone. But in a world rife with invisible threats, the miasmas, the germs in the water, the pestilence on the wind, his own body was the final and most vulnerable fortress. He tried to protect it with rituals, perfumes, and prayers, but these were defenses against an enemy he could not see and did not understand. So we have built a picture of our knight, not as a shining hero, but as a resilient, tough, and profoundly smelly human being. He is a walking paradox, a symbol of purity and honor who lived in a state of filth, a performer of delicate courtly rituals with grime under his nails, a warrior protected by a suit of steel that was also a prison of sweat and vermin. Understanding this stinking truth does not diminish the knight's historical significance. Let's delve deeper into the social stratification of smell. We've touched on how the wealthy used perfumes, but the distinction ran deeper. The very diet of a lord versus a peasant created a different bodily aroma. A nobleman's diet, rich in meat and spiced wine, would produce a different scent than a peasant's diet of dark bread, onions, and root vegetables. The peasant who worked in the fields smelled of earth, sweat, and livestock. The knight in his leisure might smell of horse, leather, and dog. The concept of waste itself needs to be understood in its medieval context. In our modern world, we think of waste as something to be removed and hidden as quickly and efficiently as possible. In the medieval era, waste was a more visible and integrated part of the landscape. The midden heap, the pile of manure and organic refuse, was not just garbage, it was a valuable resource. Let's consider the specific hygiene challenges posed by chainmail, the primary form of armor before the widespread adoption of plate. A chainmail hauberk was a shirt made of thousands of interlinked iron rings. It was flexible but heavy and offered excellent protection against cutting weapons. However, it was a nightmare to maintain. To prevent rust, the mortal enemy of iron, chainmail had to be kept oiled. We must also consider the psychological aspect of wearing a helmet for long periods. A closed-face helmet, like a great helm or a later bassinet with a visor, dramatically altered the wearer's sensory experience. Vision was reduced to a narrow slit, creating a feeling of tunnel vision and isolating the knight from his surroundings. Hearing was muffled, dominated by the sound of his own breathing and the clank of his armor. His sense of smell was overwhelmed by the stale, hot air inside the helmet. The role of hair in medieval society was complex and symbolic. Long hair on a man could be a sign of nobility and freedom, particularly in the earlier medieval period. For women, long hair was a sign of beauty and femininity, often elaborately braided and styled. However, the practicalities of keeping long hair clean in a world without regular bathing were immense. It inevitably became greasy and was a prime habitat for lice. Let's talk about the specific smells of a medieval household beyond the obvious. Think of the kitchen, not just the food, but the smell of the firewood burning, the rancid fat in the dripping pan, the sour smell of fermenting dough, and the sharp tang of pickling vegetables. In the solar, the private chambers of the lord and lady, you would have the scent of the beeswax candles they could afford, far more pleasant than the tallow, animal fat candles used by commoners, which produced a greasy, acrid smoke. The life of a pilgrim knight, such as a Templar or a Hospitaller, presents a unique case. These men were part of monastic military orders, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their rules of life, or rules, often had specific prescriptions for hygiene. For example, the rule of the Templars dictated when and how they could bathe, which was infrequently, to avoid decadence. They were to have their hair and beards trimmed to a modest length. Their clothing was simple and uniform. The connection between bathing and medicine was also prevalent. Certain illnesses were thought to be treatable with medicinal baths, where herbs and other substances would be added to the water. A bath might be prescribed by a physician to help rebalance the humors. However, there was also a strong belief that bathing could be dangerous. It was thought that warm water opened the pores of the skin, making the bather vulnerable to attack from the miasma or bad air that caused disease. A night's breath without the benefit of modern dentistry would have been a potent force. Diets heavy in meat, coupled with rotting teeth and gum disease, created an aroma that could fell a foe at 20 paces. Let's focus on the hands and feet. A knight's feet were arguably subjected to even more abuse than his hands. Encased in leather boots or, when armored in steel sabatons, they were constantly under pressure. Like the hands, they were rarely washed. The constant perspiration in a non-breathable environment would have led to a host of fungal infections, what we would call athlete's foot, as well as blisters and sores. The woolen hose they wore would be soaked with sweat and rarely cleaned. The cultural perception of dirt itself is worth pondering. In a society that was largely agrarian, dirt was not necessarily a negative thing. Good, clean dirt was the source of life, the soil from which crops grew. To be a little dirty from honest work in the fields or the stables was not shameful. The distinction was often between clean dirt, earth, mud, dust, and filth, human and animal waste, rotting garbage, and the slime of the city kennel. Let's explore the role of animals inside the castle keep. We've mentioned dogs, but they were not the only non-human residents. Cats were kept to control the rodent population. More exotically, hawks and falcons used for hunting were highly prized and often kept indoors on perches, even in the lord's chambers. These birds of prey, while noble, were still animals. They would cast pellets of indigestible fur and bone onto the floor, and their droppings, known as mutes, had to be cleaned up. The development of soap is a key part of this story. Soap existed in the medieval period, but it was not the mass-produced, pleasantly scented bar we know today. It was typically made from animal fat tallow boiled with lye potash from wood ash. This resulted in a harsh, greasy, and often unpleasant-smelling soft soap. It was effective at removing grease, but was hard on the skin and fabrics. Let's consider the impact of a knight's hygiene on those around him, specifically his lady. The poetry of courtly love speaks of the knight's adoration and the lady's ethereal beauty. The reality of a physical relationship would have been an encounter between two individuals who, by our standards, were quite unhygienic. The lady, while perhaps cleaner than her armored husband, was still a product of her time. A romantic encounter would have been an exchange of powerful, unfiltered human scents. The medieval jakes, or privy, is a subject of endless fascination. Beyond the grand castle guardrobe, more common dwellings had simpler arrangements. A privy might be a small shed in a backyard with a bench over a pit. In a town, it could be a shared facility at the end of a tenement block. The waste, or gong, was periodically cleaned out by a gong farmer, a highly unpleasant but essential job. These men worked at night to minimize the public nuisance of the smell. The very color palette of the medieval world was affected by the grime. We imagine brilliant heraldry, bright velvets, and shining armor. And on the day they were new, they were. But daily life quickly took its toll. Dust from the roads, soot from the fires, and general grime would settle on every surface, muting the colors. Fabrics would fade and stain. The brilliant white surcoat a knight wore over his armor to reflect the sun would soon be a dingy gray, stained with rust, sweat, and blood. The concept of a healthy environment was tied to the landscape. Swamps and marshes were considered deeply unhealthy places, not because of mosquitoes carrying malaria, though they did, but because of the foul-smelling, stagnant air and water, the miasma. A castle would ideally be built on high, breezy ground, not just for defense, but because the moving air was thought to be cleaner and healthier. Let's look at the knight's equipment beyond his armor. His saddle, bridle, and all the tack for his horse were made of leather that required constant care. He might have a leather satchel for personal items and a waterskin, also made of animal hide, which could impart a distinct flavor to the water it held. His tent on campaign was made of heavy canvas that was not entirely waterproof and could become mildewed and smelly in wet weather. What about regional differences? Hygiene standards were not uniform across Europe. In Moorish Spain, for example, the influence of Islamic culture, with its religious requirement for ritual ablution, meant that bathing and public baths were far more common and sophisticated than in Christian Europe. The city of Cordoba in the 10th century was said to have hundreds of bathhouses. Rust was the enemy of armor, a creeping orange death to a knight's most valuable possession. It was fought not with water, but with sand, vinegar, and vigorous scrubbing, a dry and dusty kind of cleaning. The medieval legal system even touched upon hygiene. There are records of town ordinances that attempted to regulate public sanitation. Laws might be passed forbidding the dumping of waste in certain rivers or dictating where butchers could dispose of offal. People could be fined for tossing their chamber pots into the street without due warning. However, the enforcement of these laws was patchy at best. The resources and infrastructure for a comprehensive waste management system simply did not exist. Let's consider the Crusades and the new hygiene challenges they presented. A knight from Northern Europe traveling to the hot, arid climate of the Holy Land faced a new set of problems. The heat was intense, leading to profuse sweating and a constant risk of dehydration. He encountered new diseases to which he had no immunity. He was exposed to new types of insects and parasites. The dust was pervasive. The logistics of supplying a large army with clean water in such an environment were a nightmare. The sound of a knight's armor was a key part of his presence. It was not a silent suit. The overlapping plates of steel, the chainmail underneath, and the leather straps all created a symphony of sounds as he moved. A soft clanking, a creaking of leather, a jingle of mail. This sound announced his presence and his status. It was the sound of the warrior class. However, this sound also meant he could never move silently. The relationship between a knight and his squire was one of deep intimacy, born of shared hardship and proximity. The squire saw the knight at his most vulnerable, tired, wounded, sick, and stripped of his glorious armor. He was the one who had to handle the stinking gambeson, clean the soiled armor, and dress his master's sores. This daily, unglamorous service forged a powerful bond that went beyond mere employment. It was a relationship of trust and dependence. Let's think about the afterlife of a knight's clothing and armor. These items were incredibly valuable and were never simply thrown away. Armor was passed down from father to son, repaired and modified as needed. When it was beyond repair, it would be melted down and reforged. Clothing was worn until it fell apart. A nobleman's fine tunic, when it became worn, might be passed down to a servant, who would wear it until it was threadbare. The symbolism of white is important in this context. A new knight was often ceremonially bathed and then dressed in a white tunic, symbolizing his new, pure status. The Knights Templar wore a white mantle over their armor, representing their purity and renunciation of the sinful world. This emphasis on the color white as a symbol of spiritual cleanliness is a powerful contrast to the physical reality. So as we draw our journey to a close, let's look back at the image of our knight. We have stripped him of his shining armor, not to mock him, but to understand him more completely. The stinking truth of his existence, the sweat, the filth, the parasites, the disease, does not make him less of a historical figure. It makes him more formidable. To truly grasp the knight's world, we must consider the medieval concept of time and routine. Life was dictated not by the clock, but by the sun and the church bells. The day began at dawn with prayers, followed by the morning meal. The afternoon was for training, hunting, or managing the estate. The evening meal was the main social event, followed by more prayers and an early bedtime. Within this rhythmic, agrarian schedule, there was little room or impetus for dedicated personal hygiene routines. Let us explore the idea of occupational hazards for a knight. We think of wounds and death in battle, but the more insidious hazards were environmental. Tetanus, for example, caused by bacteria found in soil and manure, was a constant threat. Any puncture wound, from a splinter to an arrow, could introduce the deadly lockjaw. The smoke-filled halls led to chronic respiratory ailments like bronchitis. The role of women as healers within the household cannot be overstated. While university-trained physicians were rare and expensive, The lady of the castle was often a skilled practitioner of herbal medicine. She would maintain a garden of medicinal herbs and be responsible for brewing potions, making salves, and dressing wounds for her family and household staff. Her knowledge, passed down through generations, was the first line of medical defense. The straw on the castle floor was a clever invention for its time, but it was also a repository of filth, soaking up spilled food, ale, and animal waste, only being changed when it became unbearable. The mental fortitude required to wear armor is a topic worth expanding. Imagine being locked inside a steel container that severely limits your movement, vision, and hearing. It's hot, claustrophobic, and heavy. Now, imagine wearing it for 8 to 10 hours a day, performing strenuous physical activity. The psychological stress would be immense. Panic attacks, feelings of helplessness, and sheer exhaustion were real risks. Let's consider the specific filth of the blacksmith's forge, a place central to a knight's existence. The forge was where his armor was made and repaired, his weapons sharpened, and his horse shod. It was a place of intense heat, noise, and dirt. The air was thick with coal smoke and the metallic smell of hot iron. The floor was a packed layer of earth, coal dust, and metal shavings. The blacksmith and his apprentices were perpetually covered in a fine layer of black soot. We should also touch upon the hygiene, or lack thereof, of children in a medieval castle. Noble children were raised by wet nurses and servants. Their infant mortality rate was tragically high, due in large part to unsanitary conditions and contaminated food or water. They played on the same rush-covered floors as the dogs, exposing them to a host of parasites and germs from a very young age. The concept of disgust is a powerful human emotion, and it is culturally conditioned. What we find disgusting, a medieval knight might have found unremarkable. The sight of a butcher slaughtering an animal in the street, the smell of the tannery, the feel of a louse crawling in his hair. These were sensory inputs that his brain had learned to categorize as normal. His disgust might have been triggered by different things: an act of cowardice, a breach of oath, or a display of dishonor. Let's talk about the journey. A knight was often a man on the move, traveling between his lord's various manors to court or on campaign. Travel was slow, arduous, and dirty. Roads were often unpaved tracks that turned to impassable mud in the rain. He would sleep in monastic guest houses, crowded inns, or simply in a tent by the side of the road. At an inn, he might have to share a bed not only with his own men but with complete strangers, all huddled together for warmth. The social ritual of hand-washing at a feast, the lavabo, had layers of meaning. On the surface, it was a practical gesture. Since people ate with their hands, it was polite to offer a chance to rinse them. But it was also deeply symbolic. It was a ritual of purification before the communal act of breaking bread. Echoing the priest's washing of hands during the Mass, the water was often scented with rosewater or other flowers, turning a simple rinse into a luxurious sensory experience. The idea of a sick room did not exist in the modern sense. When a knight fell ill, he was not isolated in a sterile environment. He would typically remain in his bedchamber, often the same room where others slept and socialized. Family and servants would attend to him, but without any concept of quarantine or infection control. They would share the same air, handle the same objects, and be in constant close contact with the sick person. The impact on the natural environment around a castle was significant. The constant dumping of waste from the guardrobes and kitchens turned the moat or a nearby stream into an open sewer. The smoke from the hearths contributed to air pollution. The constant demand for firewood led to deforestation in the surrounding area. A castle, while seemingly in harmony with the landscape, was actually a concentrated point of pollution. Let's consider the knight's voice and how it was affected by his environment. The constant exposure to wood smoke would have made his throat raw and his voice hoarse. Chronic coughs were likely common. To be heard in a noisy great hall or on a chaotic battlefield, he would have had to shout, straining his vocal cords. When wearing a helmet, he had to project his voice through a narrow slit, which would have been muffled and distorted. The medieval relationship with nudity was complex and different from our own. While the church preached modesty, communal nudity was not uncommon in certain contexts. People of the same sex would bathe together in public bathhouses or rivers without the intense sense of shame that might be felt in later periods. In the cramped sleeping quarters of an army on the move, men would have been accustomed to seeing each other in various states of undress. They did not understand germ theory. Sickness was a matter of divine will or imbalanced humors. A bad smell was unpleasant, a miasma, but its connection to disease was a mystery yet to be solved. The medieval medicine cabinet was a collection of herbs, minerals, and animal products. A salve for wounds might be made from lard mixed with comfrey or yarrow. A potion for a fever might involve willow bark, which we now know contains a precursor to aspirin. But alongside these semi-effective remedies were more bizarre ingredients based on superstition and folklore. The very texture of the world was different. Imagine running your hand over the surfaces in a knight's life. The rough, splintery wood of a trestle table, the coarse weave of a woolen blanket, the cold, unyielding iron of a chainmail shirt, the greasy, supple feel of a leather strap, the damp, gritty surface of a stone wall. Our modern world is filled with smooth, machine-made surfaces, plastic, glass, polished steel. The medieval world was overwhelmingly organic, rough, and handmade. Let's focus on the squire's most disgusting job, cleaning the armor after use. If his knight had been forced to relieve himself in his suit, it fell to the squire to clean up the mess. This would involve dismantling the leg armor, removing the soiled padding, and washing it as best he could, likely in a river or with a bucket of water. He would have to clean the inside of the steel plates themselves. This was a foul, humiliating task, but an absolutely essential one. The concept of a fresh start was difficult to achieve. In our world, we can take a hot shower, put on clean clothes, and feel like a new person. For a knight, this was nearly impossible. Even if he took a rare bath, the moment he put on his perpetually unwashed woolen tunic and leather belt, walked across the rush-covered floor, and sat down in the smoky hall, he was immediately re-immersed in the grime of his world. There was no escaping it. The role of the seasons in hygiene cannot be overemphasized. In spring, the melting snows and rains would turn castle courtyards and city streets into a sea of mud. It was a time of dampness and chill. Summer brought the heat that amplified every foul smell and the swarms of flies that bred in the waste. Autumn was the season of slaughter, as animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed and preserved, filling the air with the smell of blood and smoke. Let's consider the psychological defense mechanisms a knight might have employed. To cope with the constant discomfort and filth, he would have had to develop a form of mental detachment. He learned to ignore the stench, the itch of a louse, the chafing of his armor. This was a necessary survival skill. This ability to mentally block out physical misery was likely what made him such a formidable warrior. The knight's diet lacked many things, but one of the most significant was fiber. A diet heavy in meat and fine white bread, with few fresh vegetables, would have led to chronic constipation and other digestive issues. This would have made the already difficult process of relieving oneself even more uncomfortable. Digestive ailments were common, and were treated with herbal laxatives or purgatives, which could be harsh and unpredictable. The contrast with the monastic life is illustrative. While a knight's life was one of worldly grime, a monk's life was a quest for purity, both spiritual and, to some extent, physical. Monasteries often had more advanced water management systems than castles, with running water for lavatories and wash basins. The monastic rule dictated regular washing of hands and faces. The humble flea was a mighty giant in the medieval world. Fleas were not just a nuisance, they were a fact of life. They lived in the straw, the bedding, the clothes, and the furs of rich and poor alike. People became accustomed to the constant bites, but the flea was also a deadly vector. The species of flea that lived on black rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis. When the rat died, the flea would seek a new host, often a human. Let's think about the smell of fear. In the stress of battle, the human body produces a distinct scent through sweat. In a mass of terrified men and horses, this smell would have been palpable. It would have mixed with the smell of blood, sweat, and excrement to create a unique and terrifying aroma of battle. A veteran knight would have known this smell intimately. It was the scent of his profession, the olfactory signature of life-or-death combat. The concept of clean was often more about the purity of the soul than the state of the body. To be clean in God's eyes was paramount. A dirty body was merely a temporary vessel for an immortal spirit. The chivalric code demanded that a knight protect the weak and defenseless. This ideal is a beautiful one, but it stands in stark contrast to the reality that his own lifestyle contributed to the suffering of the weak. The waste from his castle polluted the water that peasants downstream might drink. The diseases that festered in his army camps could spread to civilian populations. In conclusion, the story of the knight's hygiene is not about shaming the past. It's about building a more complete and honest picture of it. It forces us to use our historical imagination, to try and smell, feel, and hear the world as they did. The stinking truth reveals a world where resilience was paramount, where the line between life and death was thin, and where the concepts of clean and dirty were woven into the very fabric of society, religion, and power. To truly appreciate the knight's predicament, let's consider the science of smell and memory. The olfactory bulb is directly connected to the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion and memory. This is why a particular scent can trigger a powerful, vivid memory from our past. For a knight, his entire life was encoded in smells. The scent of rust and oil on his armor was the smell of his duty. The smell of his horse was the smell of his mobility and power. The disposal of kitchen waste is a detail that adds another layer to our picture. All the inedible parts of animals, bones, entrails, heads, and spoiled food had to go somewhere. This offal was often simply tossed into a designated pit within the castle grounds or directly into the moat. This created a permanent, rotting pile of organic matter that attracted rats, flies, and stray dogs. It was a constant source of foul odors and a breeding ground for disease. Let's examine the role of the barber surgeon, a key figure in the knight's life. This was the man who cut his hair, shaved his beard, and performed minor surgery. The red and white striped pole we still see today originally symbolized the two main services, red for bloodletting and white for bandages. The barber surgeon was a craftsman, not a university-trained physician. His tools, razors, knives, and saws were rarely cleaned between customers. The concept of a breath of fresh air is a modern luxury. In the medieval world, truly fresh, clean air was hard to find. Indoors, the air was smoky and stale. In a city, it was thick with the fumes of industry and waste. Even in the countryside, the air could be heavy with the smell of manure from the fields or the smoke from a nearby village. The idea of pristine, unpolluted air was not a daily reality. Let's consider the knight's mental map of his world. It was not just a map of castles and towns, but a map of sensory experiences. He knew which towns had the worst-smelling tanneries, which rivers were too foul to drink from, and which forests offered the clean, sharp scent of pine. His movements through the world were guided by this sensory knowledge. A foul smell could be a sign of danger, an approaching army's latrine pits, a plague-stricken village. The fabric of a knight's surcoat offers a final, poignant image. This was the linen or silk garment worn over the armor, often emblazoned with his coat of arms. It was his identity on the battlefield. It was also completely exposed to the elements. It would be spattered with mud, rain, and the blood of his enemies and himself. It would be torn and frayed by the rigors of combat. The concept of personal space was fundamentally different. In a world where people shared beds with strangers, ate from common dishes, and lived in crowded halls, the modern notion of a private bubble was non-existent. This constant physical proximity had profound social and hygienic implications. It fostered a strong sense of community and interdependence, but it also meant there was no escape from the smells, sounds, and sicknesses of others. A knight was never truly alone. Let's explore the medieval attitude towards insects. They were not seen as vectors of disease, but as a nuisance and a symbol of decay. Flies were associated with Beelzebub, the lord of the flies. Maggots, which seemed to appear spontaneously on rotting meat, were seen as a sign of corruption. Lice and fleas were simply a trial to be endured, a part of the curse of Adam. Perfumes and pomanders, small balls of fragrant herbs and spices, were not for pleasure alone. They were a desperate defense, a personal cloud of scent to ward off the stench of the world and the people in it. The judiciary system even accounted for the realities of filth. A trial by ordeal was an ancient practice where an accused person's guilt or innocence was determined by a painful test, such as carrying a hot iron. The wound would be bandaged, and if it healed cleanly after 3 days, the person was declared innocent, as God had performed a miracle. If it festered, they were guilty. In a world without antiseptics, any wound was likely to fester. Let's consider the impact of fasting on the knight's life. The church calendar was filled with fast days, where the consumption of meat was forbidden. On these days, the noble diet would shift to fish, which was often salted or pickled for preservation. This change in diet would have had its own effects on the body and its odors. The smell of frying fish would replace the smell of roasting meat in the Great Hall. The social implications of a skin disease are worth noting. In a world without effective treatments, a skin condition like eczema, psoriasis, or a bad case of acne could be a source of social stigma. While common, a visible affliction could be interpreted as a sign of inner corruption or divine punishment. The most feared skin disease was leprosy, which resulted in complete social ostracism. The role of the church in providing what little sanitation existed should not be overlooked. Large monasteries, with their organized labor and engineering knowledge, often had the most sophisticated water management systems of the age. They constructed conduits to bring fresh water from distant springs and built elaborate drainage systems for their latrines and washrooms. Let's consider the specific challenges of a siege from the perspective of the besieged. A castle under siege was a closed system, a trap. As the siege wore on for weeks or months, the conditions inside would deteriorate rapidly. Food supplies would dwindle. The water in the well might be contaminated or run low. The small space would become incredibly overcrowded with soldiers and refugees from the surrounding countryside. Waste would pile up, with no way to dispose of it. The development of plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries, while offering superior protection, actually made some hygiene problems worse. Unlike flexible chainmail, which allowed for some air circulation, a full suit of plate armor was a nearly airtight container. It trapped heat and sweat even more effectively, turning the knight into a walking pressure cooker. The increased weight and rigidity also made it even more difficult to remove for personal needs. Let's revisit the pomander. This small, often beautifully crafted metal ball was a personal air freshener. It was perforated and contained a ball of aromatic substances, typically a mixture of ambergris, a waxy substance from sperm whales, musk from the musk deer, civet from the civet cat, and various spices and herbs. These animal-based, not to remove the source of the bad smell, but to mask it with something stronger and more pleasant. It was a defensive, not an offensive, strategy in the war against stench. The medieval understanding of contagion was based on observation, but led to the wrong conclusions. During the Black Death, people noticed that the plague seemed to spread from person to person. Their explanation, however, was not germs, but that the sick person's gaze could be poisonous, or that the disease could travel on the sound of their voice or the smell of their breath. Let's think about the knight's retirement. If he survived the perils of war and disease, what did his old age look like? He would likely suffer from a host of chronic conditions. His joints would ache from a lifetime of wearing armor. His hearing might be damaged from the noise of battle. His lungs could be scarred from years of breathing wood smoke. His body was a roadmap of the hardships he had endured. The shared bed was common, even among the nobility. Knights on the road or guests in a castle would huddle together for warmth, sharing their body heat, their snores, and their multitude of odors. The contrast between the knight's world and the fantasy version is immense. In fantasy stories, heroes emerge from a battle with a few artful scratches, their hair still perfect. They travel for weeks through the wilderness and remain clean-shaven and well-groomed. Their castles are bright, airy, and immaculate. This sanitized version is appealing, but it robs the characters of the very real struggles that would have defined their existence. The role of linen in this story is crucial. Linen, made from the flax plant, was the primary fabric for undergarments, bedding, and coifs. Unlike wool, it is smooth, absorbent, and relatively easy to wash and dry. It was the barrier between the knight's skin and his rough, dirty outer garments. The availability of clean linen was one of the single biggest factors in a person's level of comfort and hygiene. The color of a knight's teeth would have been a telling detail. Without whitening toothpastes or professional dental care, teeth would have naturally been a shade of yellow or gray. They would be stained by wine and food. A diet high in sugars from honey and fruit would contribute to decay, leading to black spots and cavities. The overall impression of a medieval smile would not be the brilliant white we prize today, but a more organic and often dilapidated look. The sounds and smells of a military camp at night are worth imagining. The fires would be burning low, casting a smoky haze over the tents. The sounds would be the coughing and snoring of hundreds of sleeping men, the nervous whinny of a horse, the cry of a sentry. The smells would be a potent combination of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, stale ale, horse manure, and the ever-present stench from the latrine trenches. Let's explore the concept of the body politic, the idea that a kingdom is like a human body with the king as its head. This metaphor can be extended to hygiene. The health of the kingdom depended on all its parts working in harmony. The filth and disease in the slums of a city were a sickness in the body of the kingdom, a weakness that could threaten the whole. The knight, as part of the military arm of the body, had a duty to be strong. The chivalric ideal of courtesy was a form of social hygiene. It involved a complex set of rules about how to speak, how to eat, and how to behave in the presence of ladies and superiors. It was about controlling one's baser instincts, greed, anger, lust, and presenting a polished, civilized exterior. This behavioral code was a way of cleaning up the rough, violent nature of the warrior class. Consider the sheer amount of labor required to maintain a knight's lifestyle. It took a small army of people: the squires who tended his armor, the grooms who cared for his horses, the laundresses who washed his linen, the cooks who prepared his meals, the blacksmiths who forged his weapons. Most of these jobs were dirty, strenuous, and thankless. The knight's gleaming public image was built on the foundation of this immense, and often filthy, labor. In the final analysis, the medieval knight was a man of profound contradictions. He was a pious Christian who engaged in brutal violence. He was a practitioner of courtly love who lived in a state of personal filth. He was a symbol of order and justice in a world that was chaotic and cruel. It is these contradictions that make him such an endlessly fascinating figure. Let's delve into the specific problem of rust, the cancer of armor. A knight's suit of steel was his most valuable possession after his horse, and it required constant vigilance. Rain, morning dew, or even the acidic sweat from his own body could start the process of oxidation. If left unchecked, rust could pit the metal and weaken it, a potentially fatal flaw. The primary cleaning method was abrasion. Medieval conception of disease was not just about humor, but also about sin. Sickness was often interpreted as a punishment from God for personal or communal sins. During a plague, for example, people would flock to churches to pray for forgiveness. Processions of flagellants would whip themselves in the streets, hoping to appease God's wrath through self-punishment. This belief system had a major impact on hygiene. If disease was a spiritual problem, the solution was spiritual, not physical. Wounds on the battlefield were not cleaned with antiseptics. They were washed with wine or urine, then packed with moss or cobwebs, creating a fertile ground for gruesome and often fatal infections. Let us imagine the sensory experience of entering a great cathedral for a major feast day. A knight, accustomed to the earthy smells of his castle, would be overwhelmed. The air would be thick with the smoke of hundreds of beeswax candles, a rich, honeyed scent. The clergy would be swinging censers, releasing billowing clouds of expensive frankincense and myrrh. The combined aroma would be intoxicating, deliberately designed to create an atmosphere of awe and reverence. a scent of heaven on earth. The floor rushes of the Great Hall were a complex ecosystem. They weren't just straw. They were often mixed with fragrant herbs like meadowsweet, chamomile, or lavender to try and combat the foul odors. However, these sweet smells would soon be overwhelmed by the reality of what was dropped into them. The rushes became a breeding ground for insects and a feeding ground for rats and mice. The knight's relationship with water was one of profound ambivalence. Water was essential for life, for drinking, for cooking, for agriculture. But it was also a source of danger. Rivers could flood, wells could be poisoned by an enemy, and stagnant water was correctly associated with disease, though for the wrong, miasmatic reasons. The sea was a vast, terrifying, and largely unknown entity. Bathing, as we've seen, was viewed with suspicion. Let's consider the specific hygiene of a crusader castle in the Holy Land. These fortresses, like cracked chevaliers, were marvels of military engineering, but they housed large garrisons in a hot climate. They had sophisticated systems for water collection and storage, but sanitation was a major challenge. The guardrobes often emptied onto the rocky slopes below the castle, where the waste would bake in the sun, creating a horrific stench and attracting swarms of flies. The medieval sense of self was different from our modern individualistic one. A knight's identity was largely defined by his lineage, his lord, and his social role. This more communal sense of identity extended to the body. His body was not just his own. It belonged to his family line and to the feudal system he served. This may help explain the lack of emphasis on personal, private hygiene. Let's visualize the knight's morning routine. He would wake at dawn, likely on a straw pallet or in a shared bed. He would not head for a shower. He would likely just give his face and hands a quick rinse from a basin of cold water. He would then dress in the same clothes he wore the day before, or perhaps change his linen undergarment if he was lucky. He would attend morning mass, then have a simple breakfast, often bread and ale. The medieval town was a corporation of smells. Different streets were often named after the trades practiced there. Tanner's Row, Butcher's Lane, Fishamble Street. A person could navigate the city by nose. The acrid smell of the tanneries, the metallic tang of the smiths, the sweet smell of the bakers, the stench of the fishmongers, all created a sensory map. A knight visiting a town would be assailed by this complex and often overwhelming symphony of odors. The sword belt and scabbard were more than just functional items. They were symbols of a knight's status. They were often made of fine leather and decorated with silver or bronze fittings. However, like all leather goods, they were absorbent. The scabbard, often lined with fleece or wool to protect the blade, would trap moisture and could contribute to the sword rusting if not cared for. The belt itself would absorb the knight's sweat, becoming a permanent part of his personal scent profile. The psychological impact of living with chronic pain must be considered. A knight's life was one of constant physical stress. Old injuries, arthritis, rotting teeth, and skin ailments would have meant that most knights lived with some level of constant, nagging pain. There were no effective painkillers beyond alcohol and some herbal remedies. This chronic pain would have affected his mood, his temperament, and his decision-making. A man in constant pain is a man on edge. Let us consider the role of furs in noble dress. Furs from animals like ermine, sable, and fox were a major status symbol, used to line and trim the robes of both men and women. They provided excellent warmth but were also a paradise for fleas and lice. Cleaning them was nearly impossible. They would be brushed and aired out, but they retained smells and parasites. The luxurious, soft feel of a fur-lined cloak came with the near certainty of sharing it with a host of tiny, unwelcome creatures. The leather straps holding a suit of armor together would absorb sweat and grime, becoming stiff and brittle. They would crack and fray, smelling perpetually of stale perspiration and old animal hide. The medieval world was a world without screens. All entertainment and information came through direct, unmediated human interaction. News was carried by heralds and travelers. Stories were told by minstrels in the Great Hall. Music was live. This meant that all social life was face-to-face, or perhaps nose-to-nose. There was no escaping the physical presence of other people. The humble chamber pot was a centerpiece of medieval domestic life. It resided in the bedchamber, often under the bed. In the middle of the night, a person would use it rather than navigating the dark, cold castle to find the wardrobe. The contents would then remain in the room until the morning, when a servant would be tasked with the unpleasant job of emptying it. This meant that the place where a knight slept was also, for many hours, the place where his own waste sat in an open container. The horse was the engine of the medieval world, and the knight's warhorse was the pinnacle of equine breeding. But these powerful animals were also fragile. They were susceptible to disease and injury. A knight's success depended on keeping his horses healthy, a task that fell to his grooms. This involved feeding, watering, and grooming the animals, as well as the endless, smelly task of mucking out the stables. The health of the horses was a constant source of anxiety. Let's focus on the feet again, specifically in armor. The steel sabatons that protected a knight's feet were hot, rigid, and heavy. Inside them, the knight's feet were wrapped in woolen hose and possibly a leather shoe. The lack of ventilation would lead to profuse sweating, creating a perfect environment for trench foot and other fungal infections. The pressure from the steel could cause blisters and sores. The medieval palate was different from ours. They had a fondness for strong, pungent flavors. Spices like pepper, cloves, and ginger were used heavily by the wealthy, both to flavor food and to show off their ability to afford expensive imports. There was also a love for sour and fermented flavors, seen in the use of vinegar verjuice in sauces and the consumption of pickled foods. Let us contemplate the sound of filth. It's not a silent thing. It's the buzz of flies over a refuse pit. It's the scratching of rats in the walls. It's the squelch of a boot in the muddy, waste-filled street. It's the drip, drip, drip of a leak in the roof, feeding the damp that allows mold to grow. It's the wet, hacking cough of a man with a lung infection. The lack of hygiene created its own soundscape, a constant, low-level chorus of decay, infestation, and sickness. The disposal of a knight's armor after his death is telling. As an incredibly valuable item, it would be inherited by his son or sold to another knight. It would carry with it the dents and scratches of its former owner's life, and also his ingrained grime. The new owner would have it adjusted, polished, and perhaps restrapped, but the essential steel shell remained the same. An old suit of armor was a historical document, a physical testament to the lives it had protected. The role of the church as a sanctuary was not just spiritual, but sensory. To step from the chaotic, smelly street into a cool, quiet church was a profound transition. The eyes adjusted to the dim light filtered through stained glass. The ears were met with silence or the sound of plainsong chant. The nose was greeted by the clean, otherworldly scent of wax and incense. It was a deliberate, theatrical manipulation of the senses, designed to transport the visitor from the profane world to a sacred space. The medieval concept of freshness was relative. Without refrigeration, food was preserved by salting, smoking, pickling, or drying. Fresh meat was often from an animal slaughtered that day. Fresh fish meant caught from the castle's own fish pond. But many staples like salted cod or cured bacon were by definition not fresh. The taste of salt and smoke was the taste of survival, the flavor of food that would last through the winter. The knight's gauntlets were his armored hands. They allowed him to grip his sword and shield while protecting his fingers from being crushed or severed. They were typically made of overlapping steel plates, riveted to a leather or canvas glove. This inner glove would become saturated with sweat and grime, just like his other padded garments. It would be stiff, smelly, and abrasive. Imagine the gleam of polished steel, a symbol of chivalry and honor. But beneath that noble reflection lies a hidden world of sweat, grime, and an ever-present odor that history books often forget to mention. Even the cleanest of knights, one who partook in the occasional bath, would be immediately plunged back into a world of filth the moment they dressed in their unwashed clothes and walked on their straw-covered floors. The medieval world was dark. After the sun went down, light came from the fireplace, torches, or candles. Torches were smoky and dangerous. Candles were a luxury. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheap but smelled awful and produced a greasy smoke. Beeswax candles were the high-end option, burning cleanly with a pleasant smell, but they were expensive and reserved for the wealthy and the church. The communal nature of medieval life extended to laundry. Washing clothes was often done at a public fountain or a designated spot on a riverbank. It was a social gathering place for the women of the household or village. They would share news and gossip as they scrubbed and beat the household's linen. This public laundering was a visible sign of a well-run household. The sight of clean linen laid out to dry was a testament to the hard work of its women. The paradox of the knight is that he strove for a form of immortality through heroic deeds, honor, and lineage, while living in a body that was in a constant state of decay and discomfort. His quest for glory was a race against the slow, inexorable siege of filth, disease, and time. He built his legend on a foundation of unacknowledged misery. This is not to diminish his achievements, but to place them in their proper human context. Let's consider the concept of heirloom germs. In a world where clothing, bedding, and even armor were passed down through generations, the microorganisms living in them were inherited as well. A young knight putting on his father's old gambeson was also inheriting his father's community of skin bacteria, fungi, and potentially dormant lice eggs. This material continuity meant that a family's microbiological profile could be passed down alongside its name and lands. The medieval city's defenses were not just walls and gates, but also stench. The foul smell of the moat filled with the castle's sewage was a powerful deterrent to any attacker. The thought of having to wade through a thick, putrid stew of human and animal waste to place ladders against a wall was a significant psychological barrier. In this sense, the castle's lack of sanitation was weaponized. The filth was not just a byproduct of life. It was an integral part of the defensive strategy. Imagine the sensory experience of a public execution, an event a knight might attend or even preside over. It was a form of brutal street theater. The crowd would be noisy and pressed together. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. The condemned might soil themselves in fear. The sight and smell of blood and death would be raw and unfiltered. The relationship between pain and piety was deeply ingrained. Saints' lives were often filled with stories of extreme physical suffering and self-denial. A painful illness or a lingering wound could be interpreted as a test from God, an opportunity to earn spiritual merit through patient endurance. This mindset provided a framework for coping with the constant discomfort of medieval life. Let's re-examine the banquet hall floor. After a feast, the rushes would be littered with a rich bounty for the castle's pests. Discarded bones, scraps of bread and meat, and spilled wine would attract a host of creatures. Dogs would scavenge freely. At night, rats and mice would emerge from the walls to feast on the leftovers. This meant the very floor of the castle's main social space was a perpetual, 24-hour buffet for vermin. The medieval understanding of anatomy was limited and often inaccurate, based on the dissection of animals and the writings of ancient authorities like Galen. This lack of knowledge had a direct impact on the treatment of wounds. A knight with a deep cut to the arm might have a tendon stitched by a surgeon who had no clear idea of how the underlying muscles worked. The internal workings of the body were a mystery. This made every surgical intervention a dangerous gamble. Let's think about the smell of wealth. It wasn't just the absence of foul odors or the presence of perfume. It was a complex collection of specific scents. Wealth smelled like beeswax candles instead of smoky tallow. It smelled of expensive imported spices in the food. It smelled of wine instead of ale. It smelled of fine wool and silk instead of coarse homespun. It smelled of the leather and oil of a well-maintained stable of horses. The water in the moat, a dumping ground for the castle's guardrobes, was a thick, green, and putrid soup. This was the first line of defense, and the first assault on the noses of any visitors. The concept of a common cold was non-existent. Any respiratory illness, with its coughing, sneezing, and fever, could be a sign of something far more serious. In a world without antibiotics, a simple cold could easily progress to pneumonia, which was often fatal. A knight with a cough was not just a nuisance. He was a potential source of deadly disease for his entire household. The act of coughing or sneezing in a crowded hall was an effective way to aerosolize and spread pathogens to everyone present. The medieval landscape was not a pristine wilderness. It was a working landscape, shaped by human activity. Forests were managed for timber and firewood. Rivers were dammed for mills. Fields were plowed and manured. The air was often hazy with the smoke from charcoal burning or land clearing. A knight traveling through his domain was not seeing a natural world, but a world that was already heavily influenced and in many places polluted by human industry. Let's consider the knight's shield or escutcheon. It was typically made of wood planks glued together, covered with linen or leather, and then coated with gesso, a type of plaster to create a smooth painting surface for the coat of arms. In battle, this shield would take a beating. It would be dented, splintered, and pierced. The painted surface would be scratched and smeared with blood and dirt. After a battle, a shield was a wreck, a testament to the violence it had absorbed. The social life of a knight was loud. The great hall was designed with high ceilings and stone walls that created a cavernous, echoing acoustic space. Conversations had to be shouted over the noise of other people, barking dogs, and the crackling of the fire. Minstrels had to sing and play loudly to be heard. This constant high volume was the normal level for social interaction. A quiet, intimate conversation was a rare luxury, possible only in a private solar or a secluded corner of the garden. The medieval relationship to animals was one of unsentimental utility. A horse was a tool of war. A dog was for hunting or guarding. A cow was for milk and meat. While a knight might feel affection for his favorite horse or hound, the animals were fundamentally part of his property. This unsentimental view meant that their welfare was often secondary to their usefulness. They lived in close proximity to humans, but their lives were often hard and short. The very air inside a closed helmet during combat would rapidly become toxic. The knight's strenuous breathing would quickly use up the available oxygen and increase the level of carbon dioxide. This could lead to dizziness, confusion, and impaired judgment, all catastrophic conditions in the middle of a battle. A knight had to learn to manage this by lifting his visor for a gasp of fresh air whenever possible. The helmet that protected him from a sword blow could simultaneously be slowly suffocating him. Let's consider the hygiene of the soul. This was, for the medieval knight, far more important than the hygiene of the body. It was maintained through regular confession, penance, and partaking of the sacraments. A knight with a dirty soul, burdened by unconfessed mortal sin, was in a state of spiritual peril, risking eternal damnation. This is why a priest was such a crucial figure in a military camp, offering absolution to men before they went into battle. The medieval city at night was a different world. With no streetlights, the darkness was almost total, broken only by the occasional lantern of a night watchman or the light spilling from a tavern door. This darkness provided cover for all sorts of activities. It was when the gong farmers came to clean the cesspits. It was when criminals were most active. The knight's gauntlet, as a symbol, is fascinating. To throw down one's gauntlet was to issue a formal challenge. To accept a lady's glove or favor and wear it on one's helmet was a sign of devotion. This single piece of armor was both a practical tool of war and a powerful prop in the theater of chivalry. The same object that could crush a man's skull could be used to make a delicate gesture of romantic loyalty. This duality is the essence of the knightly ideal. The medieval experience of color was intense, precisely because it was often rare. The drab browns and grays of daily life made the brilliant colors of a stained glass window, an illuminated manuscript, or a noble's festival clothes all the more dazzling. The dyes used were derived from natural sources: madder for red, woad for blue, weld for yellow, and the recipes were often closely guarded secrets. To wear a vibrant color was a sign of wealth and power. Animals were a constant presence, not just in the stables but often within the castle keep itself. Dogs, cats, and even hawks brought their own smells and their own parasites into the human living space. The medieval world was a world without deodorant. The smell of human sweat was a ubiquitous part of life, and different activities produced different kinds of sweat and different smells. The nervous sweat of fear was different from the sweat of hard labor. A knight would have been intimately familiar with all of them. The smell of a group of men who had been marching or fighting for hours would have been incredibly potent. Let's think about the first moments after a battle. The adrenaline would fade, and the knight would be left with the aftermath. The field would be a scene of horrific carnage, the air filled with the cries of the wounded and dying. His own body would be aching and exhausted. His armor would feel impossibly heavy. He would be dehydrated and caked in a mixture of his own sweat and other people's blood. The very concept of comfort is a modern invention. The medieval knight did not expect to be comfortable. His clothes were abrasive, his shoes were stiff, his bed was likely infested with pests, and his home was cold and drafty. Discomfort was the baseline state of existence. This acceptance of discomfort is a key psychological difference. He did not seek to eliminate it, but to endure it. The symbolism of the sword is central to the knight. It was the instrument of his power, a symbol of justice, and often a sacred object blessed by a priest. But it was also a tool that had to be maintained. After a battle, the blade would be nicked and covered in blood, which would cause it to rust if not cleaned quickly. The squire would have to carefully wipe it down, sharpen it on a whetstone, and oil it. The medieval world was a world without disposable products. Everything was saved, repaired, and reused. A broken pot would be patched, a torn garment would be mended, a worn-out leather strap would be repurposed. This make-do-and-mend culture was born of necessity. Materials and skilled labor were expensive. This meant that objects acquired a long history of use. The cup a knight drank from might have been used by his grandfather. The chest his clothes were stored in could be centuries old. The knight's perception of his own health was tied to the theory of the four humors. If he felt lethargic, he might believe he had an excess of phlegm. If he was quick to anger, it was an excess of yellow bile. His mood, his personality, and his physical well-being were all seen through this lens. A physician's advice would be geared towards rebalancing these humors, often through diet, purges, or bloodletting. This meant that the knight's own understanding of his body was based on a completely false premise. The woolen clothes worn by a knight were heavy and difficult to clean. They were usually just brushed or aired out, meaning the smell of wood smoke, food, and body odor was woven into the very fabric. When a knight removed his helmet after hours of exertion, the release of pent-up heat and stench would have been overwhelming, a wave of stale air, sweat, and the smell of his own breath. The ideal of chivalry was a beautiful tapestry. But today, we are going to look at the threads it was woven from, threads of discomfort, practicality, and an ever-present, overpowering lack of hygiene. Forget the image of a knight emerging pristine from his tent at dawn. Picture instead a man stiff from sleeping in his padded jack, the air thick with the smell of dozens of other unwashed men. The great hall's hearth, a source of warmth and light, was also a source of smoke and soot that clung to every surface, darkening tapestries, and adding a gritty layer to the air everyone breathed. A knight's hands were his tools, for wielding a sword and for eating his dinner. The same unwashed hands that held the reins of his horse would tear into a loaf of bread moments later. The public bathhouses that existed were often viewed with suspicion by the church. They were seen as places of sin and debauchery, where vanity and lust could fester, discouraging their use for simple cleanliness. We picture a hero, riding gallantly to save a damsel, but the air around him was likely not one of roses, but of old sweat, horse, and the stale smell of unwashed wool and leather. The very air in a medieval city, where a knight might find himself, was thick with the smell of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and open sewers running down the middle of the street. It was an immersive experience. Inside the padded lining of a helmet, a knight's hair and scalp would fester. Skin conditions, sores, and infestations were not just a risk. For many, they were a simple, unavoidable fact of life. The water used for washing hands before a feast, a ritual called the lavabo, was often perfumed with rose petals. This was a gesture of civility, a fleeting mask for the grime that lay beneath the fingernails. A knight's warhorse, his trusted steed, was a magnificent animal. It was also a massive source of odor and waste, and the stables were an epicenter of pungent ammonia that permeated the entire castle yard. Consider the simple act of relieving oneself. In armor on a battlefield, this was a logistical nightmare, often resulting in a knight soiling himself where he stood, a humiliating and deeply uncomfortable reality of war. The fabrics of the era, primarily wool and linen, held onto moisture and bacteria. Unlike modern synthetics, these materials became a heavy, smelly burden when soaked with sweat, rain, or blood. The teeth of a medieval man were a roadmap of his life. Ground down by grit in the bread, stained by wine, and often riddled with decay, a smile could be a truly frightening sight. Shaving was not a daily ritual. Many knights wore beards which, like the hair on their heads, could trap food and become home to unwelcome guests. A beard was a sign of masculinity, not cleanliness. The romantic kiss, a staple of knightly tales, must be reevaluated. Given the state of oral hygiene, it was likely an exchange of potent, unpleasant aromas and flavors that we can scarcely imagine today. Bloodletting was a common medical procedure, meant to rebalance the body's humors. It was performed with unsterilized blades, often by a barber surgeon whose hands were far from clean, inviting infection. The castle stands as a bastion of power, its stone walls a testament to endurance. Yet within these same walls, the very definition of cleanliness was a world away from our own, a concept steeped in different beliefs. The medieval world was loud, but it was also profoundly smelly. Every social interaction, every meal, every journey was accompanied by a symphony of odors that we have spent centuries systematically eliminating from our lives. A knight's shield, often decorated with a coat of arms, was made of wood and covered in leather. In the heat of battle, it would absorb sweat and blood, developing a uniquely grim and organic patina. When we look at illuminated manuscripts, we see clean lines and bright colors. We must remember that the artist was creating an ideal, not a documentary. The reality was smudged, smeared, and stained. The chamber pot was the toilet of the bedroom. It was a simple ceramic or metal bowl, its contents often unceremoniously tossed from a window onto the street or yard below, adding to the general mire. The chainmail shirt, or hauberk, worn under plate armor was a web of interlocking iron rings. It was heavy, oily to prevent rust, and trapped dirt and sweat against the knight's tunic and body. To the medieval nose, certain smells were just part of life. The pungent scent of a tannery or the earthy smell of the stable were as normal as the scent of freshly baked bread. Their tolerance was far higher. Disease was a constant companion. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, was rampant on military campaigns, a direct result of contaminated food and water, turning camps into nightmarish cesspools. We must adjust our senses to understand this world. The smell of sweat and horse was perhaps the smell of power and virility. The smell of incense in a church, a holy respite from the profane stench outside. The quest for the Holy Grail was a spiritual journey. The knights undertaking it were still human, still subject to the realities of their bodies, still traveling through a world that was anything but sanitized. The gleam of armor is a beautiful lie. It conceals the chafing, the sores, the vermin, and the suffocating stench of a man trapped within his own steel shell, fighting for God and king. Consider the padding worn beneath the armor, a thick, quilted garment known as a gambeson. It was a sponge for every drop of perspiration, every smear of dirt, rarely washed and teeming with life of its own. So let us begin our journey in earnest, to strip away the myth and expose the raw, unvarnished and stinking truth of what it really meant to be a knight in shining and deeply unsanitary armor. Let's begin with the most intimate and shocking part of our knight's life, the moment he needed to relieve himself while on campaign or in the heat of battle. Forget designated latrines or a polite excuse to find a private corner. When a knight was fully encased in his suit of plate armor, a complex, multi-layered prison of steel, the simple biological functions became a terrifying logistical challenge. Now let's zoom in on the layers a knight wore, starting from the skin outwards, to understand how this problem was compounded. Closest to his body was the brise, a pair of loose linen underpants and a linen shirt. Linen was, thankfully, washable, but how often could it be washed? On campaign, fresh water was a precious resource reserved for drinking. A knight might have one or two spare sets, but he could go weeks wearing the same garments, caked with sweat, grime, and worse. The armor itself was a catalyst for this filth. A full suit of plate armor could weigh anywhere from 20 to 50 kilograms, or 45 to 110 pounds. Wearing it was an intense physical workout, and a knight would be sweating profusely within minutes of even moderate activity. This sweat had nowhere to go. It soaked into the linen shirt, then into the gambeson, creating a perpetually damp, warm environment against the skin. The problem of hygiene extends beyond the individual knight to his immediate environment, the medieval castle. While we imagine majestic stone fortresses, we must recalibrate our senses to picture them as they truly were. The air itself was a cocktail of potent smells. The primary source of heat and light was the open hearth, which filled the halls with wood smoke and soot that clung to tapestries, clothes, and lungs. Then there was the issue of waste disposal. Let's step inside the great hall, the heart of castle life. The floors were not polished stone or wood, but were typically packed earth or stone flags covered with a thick layer of rushes or straw. This was a practical solution for insulation and comfort, but it was also a hygiene catastrophe. These rushes acted as a giant, disposable carpet that absorbed everything. Now consider the knight's diet and its impact on his health and hygiene, particularly his oral health. The medieval diet for the nobility was rich in meat, fish, and bread, but often lacking in fresh vegetables and fruits, which were sometimes viewed as food for the poor. This protein-heavy diet, combined with a complete lack of dental care as we know it, was a recipe for disaster. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste. What about bathing? Surely a noble knight had access to a bath. The answer is complex. Bathing was not unheard of, but it was far from a daily or even weekly private ritual. For the wealthy, a wooden tub could be brought into a chamber and filled with heated water, an incredibly labor-intensive process. It required servants to haul bucket after bucket of water, heat it over a fire, and then haul it all away again. Because of this effort, a bath was an event, a luxury. Life on a military campaign stripped away even these rare luxuries, reducing hygiene to its most primitive level. A knight was part of a massive, moving army, a temporary city of thousands of men and animals. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Designated latrine trenches might be dug, but they were often inadequate and quickly became overflowing pits of horror, breeding grounds for flies and disease. The constant presence of vermin was another inescapable reality of a knight's life. His world was shared with a host of tiny, unwelcome guests. Lice were a certainty. They lived in the seams of clothing, in the hair, and in the padding of the gambeson. Delousing was a common social activity, a meticulous process of picking the creatures out by hand. Fleas were equally ubiquitous, infesting the straw on the floors, the bedding, and the furs that the wealthy wore. The clatter of a gauntlet picking up a lady's handkerchief is a romantic trope. The reality is that the hand inside was likely calloused, dirty, and far from the pristine image we hold so dear. Let's examine the medical knowledge of the time, which explains why hygiene was not a priority. The prevailing theory of medicine, inherited from the ancient Greeks, was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these fluids within the body. A fever, for instance, might be seen as an excess of blood, leading to the common practice of bloodletting. The clothing a knight wore when not in armor was also a significant factor in his overall hygiene. Textiles were incredibly valuable. A nobleman's wardrobe represented a significant portion of his wealth. Garments were made from wool, linen, and, for the very rich, silk and velvet. These were not materials you could simply toss in a washing machine. Cleaning was done infrequently and with great care. Wool, in particular, was difficult to wash without shrinking or damaging it. Let's return to the Great Hall, this time during a feast. The table manners of the era were governed by a strict etiquette, but one that would shock a modern diner. The primary eating utensils were a knife and the fingers. Forks existed, but were an uncommon curiosity from Italy, often seen as an effete and unnecessary affectation. Diners would use their personal knife to cut meat, and then use their hands to lift the food to their mouths. A shared cup for wine or ale might be passed down the table. The knight's relationship with his horse is iconic, a bond between warrior and steed. But the practicalities of this relationship were far from romantic. A warhorse, or destrier, was a powerful and expensive animal, a crucial piece of military hardware. It also produced a tremendous amount of waste. Stables were an integral part of any castle or noble household, and their smell was a permanent feature of the landscape. The ammonia-rich stench of horse urine and manure was pungent and pervasive. Now let's consider the treatment of wounds, a common reality for any knight. In a world without antiseptics or antibiotics, any break in the skin was a potentially fatal event. When a knight was wounded in battle, the immediate treatment was crude and often did more harm than good. A wound might be washed with wine, which had some mild antiseptic properties due to the alcohol, or sometimes even urine, which was mistakenly believed to be sterile. The very concept of cleanliness was different, often tied more to appearance and social ritual than to sanitation. To be clean before a feast meant participating in the lavabo, a ceremony where a servant would pour scented water over the hands of the lord and his guests. This was a symbolic act, a gesture of civility and respect. It was about presenting a clean facade, not about a deep, cleansing scrub. Let's talk about the city, a place a knight would inevitably visit for tournaments, courtly duties, or trade. A medieval city was a sensory overload, and not in a pleasant way. The streets were narrow, unpaved, and had no drainage system. An open sewer, known as a kennel, often ran down the center of the street, carrying a foul sludge of human and animal waste, offal from butchers, and toxic runoff from industries like tanning. The role of women, specifically noblewomen, in the hygiene of the castle is worth exploring. The lady of the castle was the manager of a large and complex household. While she was not scrubbing floors, she was responsible for directing the staff who did. She oversaw the production of linen, the making of clothes, and the general upkeep of the household. This included directing the changing of the rushes on the floor and the airing of tapestries and bedding. Personal hygiene for noblewomen also differed. A constant battle to overlay a veneer of pleasantness, an order onto a fundamentally unsanitary world, fighting smells with better smells, not with a deep clean. The medieval understanding of the body itself was fundamentally different from our own. It was not seen as a machine to be kept in perfect running order, but as a sinful, corruptible vessel for the soul. The flesh was weak, prone to temptation and decay. This religious worldview had a profound impact on attitudes towards hygiene. To spend too much time and effort on the beautification and comfort of the body could be seen as vanity, a deadly sin. A knight's hair, often depicted as flowing and luscious, was more likely a matted, greasy haven for lice and fleas, hidden away for weeks or months at a time under a padded coif and heavy helmet. Let's consider the life of a squire, the knight's apprentice. His duties were all-encompassing and deeply unglamorous. A squire was responsible for the maintenance of his knight's equipment, which was a lesson in filth management. He had to clean and oil the chainmail, polish the plate armor, and care for the leather straps. He was also his knight's personal valet, helping him dress and undress. This meant handling the knight's dirty laundry and his sweat-soaked gambeson. We must also touch upon the psychological impact of living in such an environment. When a person is born into a world where foul smells, vermin, and a certain level of grime are the norm, their perception is different. Their threshold for what is considered disgusting would be vastly higher than our own. The stench of a cesspit or a slaughterhouse, while unpleasant, would not have been shocking. It was simply the smell of a castle or a city. The contrast between the knight's public image and his private reality is stark. In tournaments, a knight was a spectacle of magnificence. His armor would be polished to a mirror shine, often specially blued, gilded, or engraved. He would carry colorful banners and be announced by heralds. His horse would be draped in a rich caparison bearing his coat of arms. This was pure theater, designed to project an image of immense power, wealth, and martial prowess. Let's consider the end of a knight's life. If he was lucky enough to die of old age rather than in battle or from disease, his final years would be marked by the accumulated damage of a lifetime of poor hygiene and physical hardship. His teeth would likely be gone, forcing him onto a soft diet. He would suffer from chronic joint pain or arthritis, exacerbated by years of wearing heavy armor and living in damp, cold castles. Old wounds would ache. The use of scent was not merely a defense, but also a statement of status. While the common person had to endure the raw stench of daily life, the wealthy could afford to curate their own olfactory environment. A knight or a noble lady would use perfumes imported at great expense from the East, made from musk, ambergris, and exotic flowers. They would carry a pomander, a metal globe filled with aromatic substances, which they could hold to their nose in a crowd. What about seasonal changes? The misery of poor hygiene was not static, it varied with the seasons. Summer was in many ways the worst. The heat would cause sweat and grime to fester on the body. It would amplify the stench of waste in the castle moat and the city streets, turning them into a buzzing, swarming nightmare of flies. Food would spoil more quickly, but winter brought its own set of challenges. The cold was relentless. It's important to remember that our modern obsession with hygiene is a very recent phenomenon. The widespread acceptance of germ theory is a product of the late 19th century, thanks to the work of pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister. The idea of daily showering, using deodorant, and brushing our teeth twice a day is largely a 20th century development, heavily promoted by advertising and public health campaigns. The knight's leather equipment deserves special mention. Beyond the major components of his armor, a knight was a walking collection of leather goods. His sword belt, the scabbard for his dagger, his boots, his gloves, and the complex web of straps, points, used to tie his armor pieces together were all made of tanned animal hide. Leather is a porous, organic material. It absorbs moisture, sweat, and oil. Over time, it would become saturated with the knight's own grime. How did they sleep? The romantic image of a knight in a grand four-poster bed is reserved for the highest nobility, and even then it was not a private sanctuary. It was common for a lord to have servants, such as a squire or chamberlain, sleeping in the same room, often on a simple pallet on the floor. Beds were stuffed with straw or feathers, which were a haven for fleas and other pests. Bed linens, being valuable, were not changed with the frequency we expect today. Let's focus again on the knight's head. The head was the most heavily armored part of the body, and the hygiene implications were severe. Under his great helm, a knight wore a padded arming cap, or coif, similar in construction to his gambeson. This cap would become saturated with sweat and oil from his hair and scalp. It was rarely, if ever, washed. This created a perfect environment for lice and for skin conditions like seborrheic dermatitis. The banquet hall, filled with lords and ladies, was not a sterile environment. It was a place where bones were thrown to the dogs on the floor, and hands, not forks, were the primary tools for eating. The hands of a knight were a testament to his life. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a courtier. They were calloused and scarred from years of wielding a sword, lance, and shield. The friction of the reins would have left permanent marks. His fingernails would have been perpetually dirty. The ingrained grime of the stables, the armory, and the dinner table impossible to fully remove. It is crucial to dispel the myth of the solitary hero. A knight never operated alone. He was the head of a small mobile unit. At a minimum, this included 1 or 2 squires and a groom to care for the horses. This group lived, ate, and slept in close proximity. Their collective hygiene, or lack thereof, created a shared environment. If one man had lice, they all soon would. The smells of unwashed bodies, dirty clothes, and close quarters would have been a constant, shared reality. Let's talk about the kitchen, the source of the night's food. A medieval castle kitchen was a place of intense activity, heat, and smoke. It was often located in a separate building or in the basement to reduce the risk of fire and to keep the smells away from the main hall. Hygiene standards were non-existent. Without refrigeration, meat was preserved by salting, smoking, or being kept alive until the last possible moment. Cross-contamination was a certainty. The soundscape of a night's life was as intense as its smellscape, and the two were often related. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of men, the whinnying of horses, the barking of dogs, all were part of the daily noise. But there were other sounds tied to the lack of hygiene. The constant buzzing of flies around the latrines and kitchens in summer, the scratching of rats in the walls at night, the sound of a person coughing and spitting, common in smoky, poorly ventilated halls. What about the church's role? Beyond its views on bathing, the church was the center of medieval life and offered a stark sensory contrast to the outside world. Entering a cathedral was an escape. The air inside was cool and smelled not of waste and sweat, but of melting beeswax candles and, on holy days, the rich, exotic scent of incense. This was a deliberate effect. The incense was believed to purify the air, drive away demons, and lift the prayers of the faithful to heaven. The concept of privacy is another modern luxury that the medieval knight did not enjoy. Life was lived publicly. The Great Hall was the center for eating, conducting business, and socializing. Bedrooms were not private sanctuaries. Even the act of using the garderobe was semi-public, with latrines often situated in small rooms with multiple seats, allowing for conversation while one attended to business. This lack of privacy meant a lack of personal space. Let's revisit the banquet, focusing on drink. Water was often unsafe to drink, especially in towns or large encampments. The most common daily beverages were therefore beer and ale, or wine for the wealthy. The fermentation process killed most of the dangerous bacteria, making them a safer alternative to water. However, the constant consumption of alcohol, even the weak, small beer drunk by all members of the household, had its own effects. The mental toll of constant warfare, combined with the physical discomfort of his daily life, must have been immense. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a diagnosis, but the symptoms were surely present. Knights witnessed and participated in horrific violence. They saw friends maimed and killed. They lived with the constant threat of a sudden, brutal death. Let's consider the fabrics used in bedding. Linen sheets were a luxury of the wealthy. Common soldiers or those of lower status might sleep between coarse woolen blankets or directly on a straw-filled mattress, known as a palliasse. Straw mattresses were a paradise for pests. They harbored fleas, lice, and sometimes even mice and rats. They also absorbed moisture and body odors and would begin to rot and smell over time. The care of a knight's hair and beard, or lack thereof, offers another window into their world. While some depictions show clean-shaven knights, many wore beards as a sign of virility and status. Without daily washing, a beard became a trap for food, drink, and anything else the day brought. Combing was the primary method of grooming, which would remove some debris but not the ingrained dirt or the smell. Think of the latrine, the garderobe. It was often little more than a stone chute extending from the castle wall, venting directly into the moat below, a stagnant pool of every kind of human waste. The very ground a knight walked on was a source of filth. The streets of a city were a quagmire of mud and waste. The courtyard of a castle was a mixture of dirt, gravel, and animal droppings. The floor of the great hall was a bed of composting straw. Even the field of battle was not a pristine green pasture. It was a muddy, chaotic landscape churned up by thousands of feet and hooves. A knight's boots, or sabatons when armored, were perpetually caked in some form of muck. How did our knight perceive his own smell? It's likely that, for the most part, he didn't. This is a phenomenon known as sensory adaptation or olfactory fatigue. Just as someone working in a bakery eventually stops smelling the bread, a knight living in a world of sweat, leather, and horses would become desensitized to his own and others' body odor. These smells were the baseline, the normal state of affairs. Consider the role of tapestries on castle walls. These were not just for decoration. They were a vital form of insulation, providing a barrier against the cold, damp stone. However, these magnificent woven artworks also acted like giant sponges. They absorbed the smoke from the hearth, the smells of cooking from the hall, and the general dampness of the air. They were rarely cleaned, as the process was incredibly difficult and risked destroying the delicate dyes. The practice of chivalry and courtly love, with its emphasis on refined behavior and adoration of a lady, seems at odds with the physical reality we've described. But this is the central paradox of the knight. He was expected to be a brutal warrior on the battlefield and a sophisticated gentleman in the hall. He was supposed to write poetry and compose songs for his lady, even as his fingernails were dirty and his breath was foul. Let's look at the very end of the medieval period, as things began to slowly change. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in the classical world, including Roman bathing culture. While change was not immediate, the emphasis on humanism and worldly experience began to subtly shift attitudes. The rise of a wealthy merchant class created new standards of domestic comfort. Forks became more common. Soap making became a more widespread and refined craft. However, these were slow, gradual shifts. The role of laundry is a tale of hard, thankless labor. The task of washing the household's linen fell to laundresses, who were usually women of low status. The process was arduous. Clothes were soaked in tubs of water, often with lye, a harsh soap made from wood ash and animal fat, which was caustic to the hands. They were then beaten against rocks or with wooden paddles to force the dirt out, rinsed in a river or stream, and laid out on bushes or grass to dry and be bleached by the sun. The water source for a castle was its lifeline and a major hygiene concern. Most castles had a well dug deep within the walls to ensure a supply of water during a siege. However, the proximity of the well to the castle's cesspits, stables, and graveyards created a high risk of contamination. Seepage through the soil could introduce dangerous bacteria into the drinking water. Let's consider the specific challenges of a tournament. While not a real battle, a joust was an incredibly violent and physically demanding sport. Knights charged at each other at high speed, the impact of the lances capable of breaking bones and causing serious injury, even death. A knight would be sealed in his armor for hours, sweating profusely under the sun. The dust kicked up by the horses would coat everything, getting into the eyes and lungs. Medical care on site was as crude as on the battlefield. The disposal of the dead was another stark reality of medieval life. In a castle or on campaign, death was common, not just from battle but from disease and accidents. The bodies needed to be dealt with quickly. Burial was the standard practice, often in a simple shroud, as coffins were an expensive luxury. A castle would have its own graveyard, often within the walls or just outside. On a long campaign, the dead were buried in shallow graves if they were buried at all. The very air a knight breathed indoors was often of poor quality. Castles were designed for defense, not ventilation. Windows were small slits, arrow loops, that let in little light or fresh air. The main source of heat, the hearth, often had an inefficient chimney or just a hole in the roof, meaning the halls were perpetually filled with a haze of wood smoke. This chronic exposure to smoke would lead to respiratory problems, stained walls, and a constant smell of soot that permeated everything.